Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone?
Good morning.
That's the sound of someone who knows we're almost done with the comp plan. It's a good sound. It's joyful.
That's right.
I see 12 o'clock. I see a whole lot of people here. I think we are ready to start. I believe I see enough planning commissioners for quorum counting. Ms. Creasy, are my eyes failing me? Am I on the right track?
No, you've got a good quorum for the commission, and I'm looking to see where we have three counselors. Three counselors.
Yep.
So both groups are eligible to call to order.
I wish to call us to order at this time, the Planning Commission City Council work session on the Charlottesville Comprehensive Plan. Council, are you in order?
We are.
Outstanding. I'd like to talk briefly about why I called this meeting of the minds. There was quite a lot of interest in council on getting up to speed on the comprehensive plan, discussing a little bit more in depth and in less of a structured way the details of the plan, just so that we're all familiar with what we're talking about, which strikes me as more than reasonable. So today I'd like to focus on concise statements and questions on big concepts on the comprehensive plan from council. Planning commissioners more than welcome to weigh in, but please be concise and respectful of council's time. Who would like to begin? Oh, and just one more thing. Let's focus on one speaker at a time. Let's try to avoid crosstalk. And please raise your hand and I'll call on you, and that'll help things move along. Who would like to speak first?
Well, just real quick, I actually do feel that when we were trying to get meetings together, it was to hear both from Planning Commission and from council. So I don't want it to be, I mean, I personally wouldn't want it to be just a focus on our thoughts. I mean, I'm happy for us to start and share our thoughts, given that ultimately will come to us. But this is something I was hoping, I think that the goal was to have more dialogue around some of these larger concepts.
Excellent, yes.
I'm not quite sure what you're waiting for, but if you're waiting for some counselor to start asking some questions, let me go ahead.
Thank you.
The first question that, and I want to hear pose a number of questions that have been raised to us. so that the consultants can respond and we can engage on those issues. The first is that there is a common criticism, which I personally believe to be based on ignorance, but I'd like to hear a more full discussion of it, that the future land use map and that the suggestions of likely higher density have not taken into account, either in any way, if you look at one batch of emails, or in an inadequate way, if you look at another batch of emails, not taken into account the effect of the University of Virginia, the effect of the student population, the distorting effect on the poverty data of the student population, the effect, if any, expected from whatever the university may end up doing. And basically the criticism is being given to us that we should reject what the consultants have done because they have just so completely screwed it up with respect to the university population. And I wonder if the consultants might be able to tell us something more about what they have done to compensate for potential distortions that are caused by the fact that students are not typical residents, that they do in fact distort some of the statistics and in fact do distort some of the needs. As I look at it, I can see places where there have been accommodations made, but I'd really like to hear the consultants answer that question directly once and for all.
Ms. Cook, would you like to take this?
Yeah, sure. I can
Thank you.
start. I'm coordinating trying to get HRNA on the call as well. They are trying to find their link in their email, so they should be joining. So the question I heard was, just to make sure I fully understood it as I was typing it down as well. There's been criticism that the future land use map and this idea of increased residential intensity haven't adequately taken into account the impacts of UVA or the potential needs of students. Again, like you said, dependent on who you're talking to, folks might feel one way or the other. So I would say, came into this working with the assessments that have been completed previously, building on those assessments, the housing needs assessment. So for example, from 2018, there was a housing needs assessment completed, and there was I think a fairly robust discussion in that document about how students, may or may not, play into various, impacts on affordability in the city. I know there was discussion during the affordable housing plan about whether there was additional, I think, considerations needed, and I would like HRNA to potentially speak to that if they join us, how they thought of that. But in general, the way we are considering this is that we have not pulled out in thinking about, for example, the sensitive community areas that we've looked at where we've used this direct census data. We've not pulled out what we think are student populations from that. We think in many ways, if you're using census data, looking at income data, it's not always extremely straightforward to do that. And so we have, in that analysis, we've not pulled out potential student data. But in general, I would say we know that the region is growing. At the same time, we know that UVA is planning for how to get more students on campus. They're also likely planning for additional students. We don't always know exactly what plans are there, but we, I would say, have not well, I would say the other way we are looking to include considerations for students in this plan is, or one of the other ways I should say, is in looking at potential intensity near UVA. intensity of development. For example, Jefferson Park Avenue, Fontaine Extended area. We've looked at, we've included additional intensity in those areas. We've included discussion of potential additional intensity in those areas as we move through zoning, to recognizing that there are areas right near the university where students are living right now, and that may be ideal areas to, allow potentially more students to live, to have sort of areas designated for additional student housing in the city, to help rein in a bit impacts on other areas of the city. But we know students need housing. We know there will always be students that aren't living on campus, and they are part of the Charlottesville community. And so we're not looking to cut students out of the conversation completely. I would like to offer, would anyone else on the consultant team like to add to that sort of high level response?
No, I think that's absolutely right. We understand that the university is a major institution within the city of Charlottesville, and it has major land use impacts. And we have to think about how those impacts affect the way that we look at not only future land use map, but as Jenny pointed out, housing, transportation, and all those different elements that would help support the growth of the university and the long-term sustainability of that institution. So as we looked at the future land use map, yes, we did plan for intensity for residential uses around the university. And as Jenny pointed out, where density could be supported to help support housing for students, as well as understanding how those areas begin to affect other residential neighborhoods around, immediately around the university for non-student use as well. So the university, we do understand that as a very important component of the city, and we planned for it and thought about it through this planning process.
So I hope that the conversation, and I didn't hear all of Councilor Stuck's question, but it doesn't become how do we ensure that university and their growth is considered in every aspect? Because part of why we're doing this in the first place is because the impact that their growth has had on the community in a negative way. The conversations that I've had with the university is them acknowledging that, and of a part of their mission to be great and good, to ensure that they are building on campus, and that based on the community needs, and they are supposed to develop these relationships with the community, that they are more strategic about where they build and where their students go and where they recommend for them to go. So those partnerships with them, and even these new developments that they're supposed to be doing, that has moved from, helping with the current housing needs to now we're having more of a conversation around workforce, housing. And I have shared my concerns with them about that. So we have to make sure that the reason that we keep at the forefront, that the reason that we're in this situation today, because no one, kept the pressure on them for them to be great and good community members. And that has to be a major part of the conversation. So unless I missed with the original question, I didn't hear the original question all the time, but based on what I just heard, I would be concerned about us making these changes. I understand that UVA students will live throughout the community, but I also think there needs to be a conversation with the university to ensure that that goes very differently than it has in previous decades.
Well, I would say, just to clarify, Mayor Walker, so the question from Councilor Snook was centered at a high level around, we've heard both criticisms that this plan hasn't considered enough impact of UVA students, or that it's considered it too much in terms of the housing need. And so we were just sort of responding to how we've thought about students in this. But I think the other thing we have thought about is, you're exactly right, Mayor Walker, this is about making sure the community as a whole has housing. We're not talking about any specific, in this discussion right now, any specific changes based on the student need. But one thing I failed to mention in the initial discussion was, beyond the future land use map, within the affordable housing plan and within the comprehensive plan document itself, it talks several times about the need to coordinate with UVA, with Albemarle County, with the regional planning groups, to make sure that everyone is playing a role in this conversation. So I want to make sure that's clear as well. The need for coordination with UVA has been mentioned throughout the document.
And if I could make a quick point to that, since what I think we also have to move towards thinking is not just the partnerships with the county, but the city in some way, whatever that looks like, being a landowner. So then that partnership looks very differently than it looks now. So that, buying land versus partnering, with the county. And I understand the regionalism and those conversation, but I think what we've heard some from the county is we have a housing crisis too that we've been trying to figure out. And I know, Councilor Payne, you're on the Regional Housing Partnership. I don't know, where that's going, but I also think that we may need to ensure in some way that we have more control over what happens on those properties than we do at this time.
So the other question that I had wanted to ask deals with the overall issue of whether there is an assumption that the consultants have made about population growth. I have suggested that we consider that the population will continue to grow in Charlottesville as it has grown largely over the last 20 or 30 years. I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but it's about the last 20, that it's grown at about an annualized 1% a year. That essentially tracks the growth of the university, which has basically grown at an annualized rate of 1% a year since about 1980. And I see no reason to think that the university is not going to continue to grow at 1% a year. Again, fits and starts, maybe not every year, but as a general average, that's a pretty good number. As long as that is likely to be the case, then I think that the city should figure that in addition to the university growing at 1% a year, the city should expect its population to grow at 1% a year, and therefore that housing starts or housing new availabilities should also grow at roughly 1% a year. This is an argument overall for more density, for not just pulling up the drawbridge and saying nobody else is allowed to come live in the city of Charlottesville. And frankly, that's only by embracing the notion that there will continue to be growth pressures that we will have to do something to ameliorate. Only by embracing that and planning for it will we be able to hold the line on housing prices for not only the very poor, not only the 30, 60, even 80% AMI, but right now the problem that people are having is that there's just not enough of the missing middle housing options that would embrace significantly more income. There's just not enough inventory out there. So my question is, have you all given any thought to whether we should, in the comp plan, embrace a particular population projection as something that we should be planning for?
So there's a discussion of that in the beginning portion of the comprehensive plan, toward the end of it, right before the guiding principles, I believe, where we pull in discussions we've been having throughout this process, including these regional projections for growth around the order of 15,000 households by 2040. We've got in the PowerPoint slides as well for tomorrow a graph that shows that the rate that Albemarle County has grown, or is projected to grow rather, and the rate that Charlottesville is expected to grow. And Charlottesville's growth rate is much lower. And that's because there's not additional housing and there's not additional growth happening in that way. And so we're not we haven't done additional analyses. That was not built into this process to do additional projection for population, but we are recognizing, you know, that you've noted, well, in a general way, more general way than you've noted, Councillor Snook, that we know there's growth happening. We know the university is here. It is growing not only in students, but then obviously in employees as well. Those kind of need to go together, I would hope. And so we know the city is growing because of UVA, because of other economic development that is happening, because people want to come and live in Charlottesville and the region. And so we are looking to provide more opportunities for that generally, but we have not put out a specific percentage per year, as you've noted, just to directly respond to that question.
Do you think that with the 1%? Do you think that the 1% average is a reasonable first step, a first approximation? Recognizing I'm not asking you to be demographer here, just what can we work for? What can we work toward?
I don't know that I can say right now that what I would, you know, as you've noted, I'm not a demographer, but you know, that is something we can. I would like to discuss with the team some more before I provide an answer there.
Okay, that's fair.
Mayor Walker, then Commissioner Stolzenberg.
And while you all and the city as a whole is thinking about that, we also have to think about what the census is telling us to date of who is leaving the city. And we have to be real intentional about how to keep those individuals in the city, or we're going to be looking at a community in the next few decades that's predominantly white and upper middle class.
That's right. And there are tracking metrics built into the implementation chapter to make sure that, you know, tracking does happen, because we've heard anecdotally that this is happening. There's a lot of pressures, and we can see trends in data as well, but that needs to be continued moving forward.
Commissioner Stolzenberg.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point from Mayor Walker. But to Councillor Snook's point, I draw you guys' attention to strategy 2.4 within the housing chapter, which aims to target a 5% rental vacancy rate in order to ensure a better functioning rental market, ideally with prices not rising as fast. And I think that is an indicator by proxy of the pressure for the population to grow. You know, we know that outlying counties are growing much faster than we are. You know, some might say that that's because people would prefer to live in Greene or in Fluvanna. Others might say that that's because there's no housing available within the city. That low vacancy rate that we have, that's the current one is discussed elsewhere in the plan. It's well below 5%. It's an indicator that the perhaps natural rate of population growth, if we didn't have all these restrictions on housing, would be faster than it is now.
Mayor Walker, you have your hand up.
Just a carryover, I think.
Thank you. Commissioner Mitchell.
Yep. I want to talk a little bit about the overlay. And to do that, I'm going to be redundant. There's no one in the meeting today that wants density for the sake of density. They want density with a purpose. I think everyone in the meeting today wants to increase the affordable housing stock. So the density should allow us to do that. The overlay would allow us to do that. But the consultants continue to recommend something else. What I'd like the consultants to do so that I can get comfortable with moving away from the overlay is, in a very net fashion, walk me through what we're going to do to increase the density with the purpose of privileging. And I'm asking us to do this for me, but I'm asking them to do this for the audience as well. How does what they're proposing to do allow us to increase density with the focus on privileging affordability in Charlottesville?
Concisely, please.
Let's see. Well, I will start that unless Lee or Ron would like to do that.
I would love it if you would go through what the two categories on the future land use map say. That'd be great.
Can you clarify what you mean by the two categories, Lee?
General residential and medium intensity.
Okay, thank you. Well, it goes beyond that, so I'll go beyond that too. But
Sensitive would be good too, yeah.
We have at a high level proposed that the zoning ordinance, when we get there, instill affordability requirements in various ways directly into zoning district language. And the reason we've done that is to more directly tie affordability to each of the land use categories rather than having it in a separate overlay. The way that works out is different depending on each category. And we have included a table in the comprehensive plan as well as in the materials for tomorrow to walk through the housing affordability framework is what we're calling it. In the general residential, for example, we've talked about allowing a base up to 4 if the existing structure is maintained, up to 4 market rate, plus additional bonus to be determined in the zoning ordinance. In the sensitive community areas within the general residential category, those would require that the first new unit be affordable and then allow additional units beyond that. The reason we've shown those two separately is that we are looking to incentivize potential housing opportunities or capitalizing on those potential housing opportunities outside of those sensitive community areas, many of which have a lot of pressures right now because they are close to UVA or they're close to downtown and they have communities that are sensitive to displacement pressures. So we are looking to allow additional development outside of those areas at that market rate level. In the general residential category. In the medium intensity category, the next step up, if you will, in the general and the residential categories, we are currently proposing using either a bonus program or another inclusionary zoning mechanism to support affordability. And so there would be a base amount of residential units allowed and then additional units depending on affordability level. We've not identified these specific levels because they require additional analyses, which is forthcoming, and we don't want to get ahead of that. Other categories, higher intensity residential, mixed use categories, corridors or nodes, those will all have affordability requirements built in some mechanism, inclusionary zoning mechanism that would likely say for some percentage of units that would need to be or as an example, some percentage of units that would need to be affordable at a level to be determined. So each category has requirements or incentives for affordability built into it in that way. I would offer before we go to maybe clarifications from the Planning Commission and Council, Lee or Ron, would you want to add to that briefly?
This is Lee. I think the only thing that I wanted to add is there's been a lot of talk about this mechanism being an overlay. And the only reason that we have softened up the language surrounding an overlay is that we intend to put it in all of the underlying districts, would have the exact same impact as an overlay, but the regulations would be with each district itself instead of being in a separate part of the ordinance. So in the interest in truly embedding these affordability ideas into each district, we'd like to combine those ideas together as part of a base district rather than as a standalone overlay. Both would have the same fundamental rules, whatever we decide those rules would be. So this is something that we can continue to talk about during the zoning process. But we are encouraging the city and we're talking to the city attorney about the use of the base districts themselves across the city in place of an overlay. But it's fine to keep using that rhetoric because I know it's been used so far, but fundamentally taking those ideas and embedding them in the base zones.
Commissioner Mitchell, did that answer your question?
It did. May I ask a quick follow-up?
Very quick, please.
Right, there seems to have been a retreat as it relates to the non-sensitive general residential and the affordability component. At the last meeting, and I believe maybe in the document that we saw, we were going to treat the non-sensitive general residential and the affordability component associated with that, like we were going to treat the sensitive general residential. And we moved away from that. And I'm wondering what the thinking was as it relates to moving away.
That was not something we proposed. So
Okay. Oh yeah. Well,
yeah.
let me correct. I think there was a strong consensus from the commission to do that. And if you guys rejected that, why did you reject that?
Well, I would say we heard comments on both sides of that. So from our perspective, we didn't see it as a strong consensus. So that's why we didn't make that adjustment. But I'm happy to hear more comments about that. But yeah, from my point of view, we heard comments on both. Quite a few comments on both sides of that.
My recollection is that the commission was pretty unanimous. Maybe if I missed you, please let me know, but I didn't hear a commissioner objecting to that.
If I could jump in, as I recall, the original overlay proposal from back in June was for the low intensity areas, which we're now calling sensitive areas, to have that second unit be affordable, and then to have a base general residential category elsewhere where there were a few by right, and then it was affordable requirements with the bonus program in that overlay up to 12 beyond that. And I mean, to me, this seems, am I wrong in saying that what's currently being proposed is consistent with that, with the CHAC overlay proposal from June, except maybe for that one thing in the sensitive areas about bonuses beyond 4, if it's heavily affordable?
Let's get back to regular order. Commissioner Habab, please. Commissioner Habab?
Oh, you're muted.
All right, thanks. I have a couple of questions kind of along the same lines, but more of a clarification of the sensitive residential and the general residential. And it's a question to the consultants and the rest of the planning commission. For the sensitive residential, we are right now, the first unit would be affordable. So essentially we would be, if a development happens, we'd be replacing the already affordable unit in the sensitive community with another affordable unit, or mandating it. Would we want to increase that affordability in those sensitive areas instead of just replacing kind of like a 1-for-1 unit? And the other part of that is on the general residential, and it's just a question of, we're giving up our what is now the one single family home to 4 units without any affordability to that 4 number. And do we want to have any there that are affordable to increase that? Or are the part of what the consultants were looking at was, will that generate enough housing that's going to be kind of like 80% AMI? Is there a specific number where when single family homeowners build ADUs, it's more affordable? I don't know what your response to that would be, but those are my questions.
So,
Please.
sorry. Okay, so in response to the second question first, I do need some clarification on the first one, but the second question, which I think is why we're not having that first new unit being at affordable at a certain level in the general residential areas outside the sensitive community areas. So I think, which is what Jose was just sort of talking about as well. And so we want to make sure that in these areas that have not traditionally had a lot of housing other than single family housing, there are some out there, there's duplexes, there's triplexes in these neighborhoods, but by and large, most are single family neighborhoods. So we want to incentivize that by making sure we want to incentivize those opportunities by making sure they are competitive with sort of the market rate for those areas right now. And so by allowing additional market rate units in those areas, we can incentivize units that would be, even if not affordable to a deeply affordable level, they will be likely smaller units that would be more sort of naturally affordable. And then with the additional bonus that could be out above that, we we believe having those market rate as a base would support additional affordable units that could be deeply affordable or affordable at a deeper level, with that market rate base. But again, you mentioned one thing that we do think is an important consideration in this, which is those housing property owners that don't want to build up to 4, they want to maybe build 1 or 2 ADUs on their property. That is one thing that we've taken into consideration with this thought around keeping the first unit's market rate. We want to make sure that it's feasible and sort of makes sense from an economic perspective for even smaller property owners to put that type of development on their property. And if we were to say require a deeply affordable ADU, that might be less accessible for a lot of people to finance without subsidy. So I guess that's my first response to your second question. Can you remind me of your first question?
Yeah, sure. It was about the number of affordable units we're proposing in the sensitive areas.
All right, okay.
And we're proposing 1 as, if you tear down this building or if you want to develop this house or whatever it is, you have to provide 1 unit, and you can provide up to 4 units total, with 1 being affordable. And my understanding is in these sensitive areas where they are sensitive because they have we want to protect the people that live there, and they have affordable units there now. So are we, instead of replacing a 1-for-1 unit, it's kind of a general question of, I guess that's kind of what we're doing, and we're not really adding any more affordability in the new built units that are going to happen there.
That's right. We're saying the first new unit should be affordable, or that can be the first new unit, or it can be the existing housing unit that's affordable. So if they want to add additional units, the existing building can be the affordable unit. But yes, we are saying 1 unit affordable to a level to be specified in the zoning. And the reason for that is we want to balance this desire to protect vulnerable communities that would be sensitive to displacement pressures, while also still allowing for wealth building in these neighborhoods. We know, there are homeowners who have owned these properties for a long time. We want to make sure that we're not making it more difficult for them to build wealth with those properties. So we've looked to balance that with the number of units that we've noted.
Okay, I guess, thank you. Sorry, just a quick thing. I guess my only concern with that, and I think that makes sense the way you have it, is just if that would fundamentally shift the demographic and make, it could kind of push people out in that sense too. If we have all these market rate units now in these neighborhoods. But it's just more of a point than, I guess, a question.
Thank you. Commissioner Russell?
Thanks. So that spoke to my first question about, basically my concern is that we may not be going far enough if we don't require more than that 4th unit to be affordable in the general residential. And I just wonder if, 1, would it even happen? Would we even start to see anyone going to that 4th? And what would be the downside in perhaps requiring the 2nd unit be affordable, and flexibility of relaxing that, rather than trying to dial it back at a later time? Do you have any thoughts to that?
Sorry. So the question, Liz, was to what's the potential harm in saying like up to 2 units, for example, would be affordable?
Requiring that the 2nd unit, as opposed to the 2nd, 3rd, the 2nd, 3rd, maybe the 4th.
Oh yeah. So it is saying that the well, so what we're proposing is that any new unit would need to be affordable.
Up to 3
the first
units.
The first new unit would need to be affordable.
So you're talking about in the sensitive, right?
Yes.
I'm talking about in general.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for my confusion. So you're asking what would be the harm of applying that in the other general residential?
Right, because we're saying, we're going from a primarily R1, let's say that most of these types are R1, and adding and going all the way up to 3 units, no affordability provision. But the 4th unit would require affordability. And I think Click and I'm asking as well, what would, what is your assessment of what would happen if the 2nd unit was 2nd or 3rd or 4th? I don't know, something more intense than the 4th unit was required to have affordability after that.
Really quick to clarify, the 4th unit isn't affordable in general residential. It's that you can maintain the existing structure is what I see on the chart.
That's right. Yeah, what we're proposing, we had proposed a couple iterations back that what you're talking about, Commissioner Russell, of having up to 4 units if the 4th was affordable. And we heard that was not going far enough. And
but
so
then affordability isn't baked into all of the zones if you're not requiring affordability in the general residential.
we are building on, there'll be a bonus program established that we have not put a specific number of units on, but we have built into this a commitment to establish that in the zoning process.
Councilor Hill?
So on the heels of that, then the bonus program is assuming that we can do more than 4 units on most of these R1 sites, which I do have a lot of pause about, because I just think there's going to be capacity issues even for up to 4 units on many of these sites. And so I share the concerns that are being raised around. I think that we should be ensuring that there's more affordability throughout more of the neighborhoods in this community. I'm not sure if it's the 1st unit or whatever. I'm not sure what the city can do to try to incentivize that, so that we're not looking at an Airbnb, which I've said before is one of my biggest concerns with some of this. But I'm just kind of echoing the concern that I think that we need to be looking at the general residential more similarly as the sensitive if we really want to achieve affordability throughout this community. And then the second point I was hoping to make that we haven't really touched on is the last time we met, I raised some very specific examples around medium intensity and where it may not be appropriate. And those were really just to be examples. And I think my question is, has the team gone through and looked at every place that they've put that medium intensity to take that same scrutiny that I've taken on just a few areas that I picked out, including Riverside, which I realize you guys have changed? Because my intention wasn't for you to like pick certain things and change them, but my intention was to understand holistically how we really looked at where medium intensity is. And I would take the position that a former commissioner shared last night, that we should keep that category because I believe there's places for it. But at this stage, until we go through the zoning, I just don't think that it's at this point appropriate to be specifically identifying locations for that medium intensity until it's really been looked at a street by street basis. And I'm curious of the consultants team's feedback on that.
Thanks. So again, I'm going to answer your second question first, and then I might need a refresher on the first one. I'm sorry. So the in terms of the medium intensity, where it's located, we did hear comments at the last time we met, both from you, Councilor Hill, as well as others about specific locations, and we did then make sure we looked more holistically at medium intensity. We've throughout this process focused on having that along near parks and schools, sort of these community hubs. We've focused on having it along corridors that we believe should be prioritized for improved multimodal transportation. But we do recognize there are some areas that are more constrained. And so we did in the refining for this, the map that you all have now, we have pulled back on a few areas that we believe that were, for example, PUDs that are currently have very small lots because they've already been part of a PUD. We've pulled back on some of those areas because we recognize, even though they are developed to a level that feels medium intensity, if we're looking at a lot by lot basis, general residential is more relevant for those locations. We've looked throughout the map at those adjustments to make them. I'd be interested to hear from others about whether how others feel about this, having this category on the land use map. We do feel it's important. It's from a planning perspective, it makes sense to identify locations for greater intensity. So that's why we have shown it how we have. I guess going back to the first part of your question, which I believe was around, again, the general residential, why not having that affordability baked in at a lower level, which Ms. Russell was also speaking to, and others. And so again, we've talked about why we have not shown that, wanting to incentivize this development in these areas that traditionally have not had this level of development. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Would it help for Councilor Hill to restate her first question?
Would you mind, Councilor? I'm sorry.
No, I was just trying to understand. I think the desire is that we have options for affordability in way more places than the sensitive areas. I certainly see the benefit of wealth building in those sensitive areas. At the same time, what I'm seeing here concerns me that there's going to be just a target on these sensitive areas at times, because that's where some of the most affordable ways to do some of these things are. And it's not going to be incentivizing beyond that. And so I also just feel like we're going to be concentrating that activity and not actually finding the affordability growth outside of those areas. And I also was just, again, like as I mentioned, when Commissioner Russell was mentioning, just this is up to 4 units if you maintain an existing structure, and none of that's affordable. And then with the medium intensity, I feel the same way. It's like, but then if you want a bonus, I understand that's where the affordability comes in. But again, as I said, my very first statement, I think, was just recognizing that it's going to be hard for so many of these parcels in R1 zoning to actually go beyond that 4th unit, in which case, what have we accomplished here? But again, I'm one of those people that I don't want density just for the sake of density.
No, and thank you for restating that, because it reminded me of what I was going to say in response to that. So I appreciate that. So in these categories we've been discussing throughout this process, we've said up to a certain number of units, up to 4 in general residential, up to 12 in medium intensity. And I believe that what we've proposed allows flexibility to say, to provide us a lower number. We've said some areas might not allow up to 4 based on constraints in the general residential, for example. We've noted that not all areas will be appropriate for up to 12 medium intensity. So I believe, and I would like Lee or others to jump in if I'm saying something they don't agree with, but I believe that this would leave us flexibility to say in the zoning ordinance, some areas might have up to 2 base units in general residential, and then the bonus would be on top of that.
Are you assuming that that the maximum capacity is more than 2? That's where I'm really having trouble piecing this. Like if we're saying that it's up to 4, and that property can't have up to 4 because it won't accommodate it, we're going to give them 2. Then what makes us think we can have a 3rd if we couldn't accommodate more than 2?
That was just an example. But I would say,
but I'm asking it more broadly. That's all. I'm just trying to.
So what I would say is I think we would look at what the sort of capacity would be on these sites, which would be within this form constraints we've talked about, as well as looking at environmental constraints. And then I believe we could say within that, the bonus and the base would be within that level of development.
Okay, so we wouldn't give them a base that actually maximizes the property. We would give them something less than that and say that if you want to maximize this, you have to do affordability. Is that what I'm hearing?
I believe, yes, but Lee, can you confirm that would be something that you would support as well?
I'm not certain I understood. If you could restate it, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
So we're saying, as we've been noting throughout, zoning districts will not be one-to-one with each of these land use categories. We'll be breaking them down. There'll be sort of transitions between height and other intensity levels. And so, for example, in medium intensity, we say up to 12 units within these areas. The zoning would allow some potential breakdown for that. Not all areas would be up to 12. Maybe some, for example, would be up to 6. And so if same for general residential. So if maybe not all areas would have, the same capacity. So if we want to ensure that there is a bonus for affordability in all areas, are we in agreement that if some areas are not appropriate or not able to handle, let's say more than 4 units of intensity with the form parameters we've established, would we then be comfortable saying, 1 unit would be allowed at a base level with additional units, maybe like 2 additional units based on affordability requirements? Would we would we be bringing down that base level with a bonus on top of that in the general residential and the potentially medium intensity?
So I think the challenge with general residential outside the sensitive areas is that we understand from research around the country that it takes about 10 units before you can generate one market affordable unit. In other words, for the marketplace to actually be able to afford to build it themselves. So we are not likely on a single lot in many of the neighborhoods in the city going to achieve that level. So right now, we've not been asking for the affordability except in ways that we would actually incent that go beyond what the market might produce. So there's a portion of this that's focused on the market producing some more housing opportunities in people in these areas. The units we're talking about are typically going to be smaller and therefore, as a new unit goes, less expensive than a large new unit that might take up a whole lot. And so while there is some natural affordability, it's hard to determine how to generate that other level of affordability out there. So we have it in a bonus system or an inclusionary system right now to be determined as we go through the zoning. But yes, some lots have more capacity than other lots, and we'll be able to offer the option for more units. We may not be asking for 4 everywhere.
That's my question, is just around the capacity of any parcel. Because if we're saying that the capacity is going to be met with a market rate, then to me, the affordability overlay doesn't even have any place in this, because we've already met the capacity. And I think that's just a fundamental question that I'm trying to have answered. So if you go through the zoning and you determine that
Majority of your lots have capacity for more than 4 units.
I'm saying as an example, I mean,
Yeah,
in the medium
just-
intensity, they could have up to 12. Okay, if we give them 12, if they can only have 8, for example, in their capacity, would we be saying that those 8 are market rate and the only way to get more than 8 is if you're affordable, but then you're beyond the capacity of the lot? I'm just trying to understand the lot's capacity versus how we're implying this overlay. Maybe someone else can explain it better than me.
So I think right now we are hoping to improve on the affordability, but there is nothing about what we're talking about so far that does not suggest that we're going to need additional funds, some kind of supplemental funds to support affordable units at these lower densities. Now, when you get to that medium intensity at the top end of that, we could potentially produce some affordable housing, but not at the 4 or 6 units level. It's unlikely to be produced without subsidy.
Councilor McGill.
Thank you, Chair. Really quickly, I just wanted to ask, how are we defining affordable?
We've included a discussion of that in the document because there has been a lot of questions about that. And we've tried to, throughout this process and through the affordable housing plan, be really clear that we're saying, affordable unit is generally thought of as something that a household does not have to pay more than 30% of their income on, including utilities, other housing costs like that. So what's affordable is different depending on what a household makes. If a household makes 80% of the area median income, what's affordable for them is different than what's affordable for a household that makes much less or much more than that. So as you may recall in the affordable housing plan, when we're talking about funding, there are funding targets established to provide half of the city's funding for affordable housing toward those who make towards housing that'll be affordable for those that make 30% of area median income, for example. So we've got this general definition of affordability, and then we've shown how we're targeting funding in that plan. We have not established right now what affordability means in terms of the bonus programs, what level of affordability we're talking about. Is that, I assume that's your question. And that's because there are additional, there is additional market work that's market analysis that's happening in that zoning piece of the process. And so we don't want to jump ahead of that.
Does it
Okay,
help?
I'm sorry,
Does that answer your question?
kind of. I mean, basically then what I'm understanding is that we haven't defined in this conversation of what we're requiring in the comp plan, what this overlay means. The definition of affordable has not been set yet.
That's right, for these land use categories. We have written into the plan to include sort of the most affordable that is possible to actually happen. And so that's the directive we've given ourselves and the city for that next piece of the process.
So also, my next question is about the mixed use nodes. I was just noticing that quite a few have disappeared entirely from previous renditions. And I was just curious as to why.
So in the May version of the map, we included, there was, I believe, 2 neighborhood mixed use nodes. Sorry, I'm looking at my map over here. That's why I'm looking away from you all. One at Rugby Road and Barracks Road, and one at Meadowbrook Heights and 250. There was a corridor, neighborhood mixed use corridor, Calhoun and Locust. You're right that those were removed from the August version of the map, and we've retained them off the map since then. And the reason for that is we did hear concerns about levels of intensity in those areas. Primarily, we believe that the sort of commercial use that we were envisioning on those sites aligns with what would be allowed within the residential districts themselves, this sort of neighborhood scale commercial uses. So yes, you're right that those were removed from the original version of the map.
So I guess, so what my concern is we have a food desert problem. We also have a walkability problem in a lot of places. So even if we could identify where in a general area recommendations would be for small local grocery stores, small, I think that would be really beneficial. That even if it's not, it concerns me that we now again are back to some very wide swaths of area that don't appear to have the ability to grow to help support food deserts in Carlos.
Well, and so to clarify again, those, and I'm sorry if I cut you off, the general residential categories, all 3 of those categories, general residential, medium intensity, and higher intensity, all support neighborhood scale commercial uses, which we'll be looking at more throughout the zoning process to see how that works out. It may be at intersections, for example, other locations like that may be most appropriate, but we want to make sure that is included as a possible use throughout these districts because of the food, not only the food desert issue that you mentioned, but also other neighborhood scale commercial uses and small business uses.
Commissioner Stolzenberg?
Thanks. I think I'll be brief. My question is really, how does the current draft differ or compare to the proposal that we received from the Housing Advisory Committee in June, and I think endorsed at our meeting this summer? And then I guess my follow-up would be, if we were to apply the same rules as for sensitive general residential to non-sensitive general, as we heard in the proposal from I think yesterday, what would be the effects on sensitive areas from that? How would it change the, incentives or protections that we're offering for those areas?
So the in terms of how this compares to the HAC Housing Advisory Committee proposal that was shared in June. So that proposal looked at sort of in areas similar to those we're saying they're sensitive community areas. It identified specific neighborhoods, recognizing further analysis was needed, which we've put forth a way to do that. They identified a proposal to keep neighborhoods, I think it was Fifeville, Rose Hill, 10th and Page, at the current level of intensity, and then allow a bonus on top of that for affordability, up to the medium, or I believe higher intensity level, depending on how affordable it was. And then the proposal outside of those few neighborhoods of concern was to allow general residential everywhere in the residential areas, and then allow medium intensity anywhere if at least, I believe, half of the units were affordable. And then with higher intensity, sorry, I'm blanking a bit on what the original proposal called for with that, but I mean, I believe it called for a similar sort of allowing that in more locations if affordability was met, affordability requirements were met. And so this differs in that we've applied a similar concept to those what we're calling sensitive neighborhood areas, sensitive community areas, keeping general residential or the base residential level lower than in other areas to help reduce some pressure there, but also and displacement there. We've got our base level of general residential that's similar, and then we've established that there will be a bonus program allowed, so we're not establishing a number of units or a percentage, but we're allowing for something similar to what was called for in the HAC proposal. We're not saying, for example, that all general residential areas should allow up to medium intensity if half are affordable, but we are leaving flexibility to look at what level would be appropriate in the zoning. So I hope that responds to that part of the question. And I'm sorry, again, could you remind me of the second question?
The second was if we were to make this new change to put the same rules that we have in sensitive areas to the rest of general, how would that change the pressures and results on what happens to those sensitive areas?
Well, I would like to hear more from our team on this too, but there would be continued pressure in those sensitive areas. We're looking at them as there's a lot of people at risk of displacement in these areas. They are prime areas of focus for development because of the location in the city. And so we would reasonably expect that if we would see less development happening in those areas outside of, or in the general residential areas outside of the core of the city, and not necessarily just the sensitive areas, but sort of the adjacent to UVA and downtown. And we would expect to see continued pressure, within those sensitive community areas. We could still say, targeting funding for owner-occupied rehab and other strategies that we've identified to help protect those communities, but from the land use perspective, there'll be less relative protection for those areas. Would anyone want to add to that from the team or NDS?
I mean, I reinforce that statement. That's if the whole city is treated the same, then the relative cost of development, as we've noted, the incentive to develop in the sensitive areas, particularly those close to the university campus, is very strong, and the cost of land is low. And so the incentive is very strong to develop there. The proposal we put together essentially creates it creates an incentive for existing property owners to be able to do something with their property, but outside investors are less incentivized to do so. But if we have the same body of rules citywide, then all the other factors that make those sensitive areas attractive for development are going to make those areas more attractive than the rest of the city. Does that make sense?
So it flips it on its head and it makes the sensitive areas the most attractive for development then?
Yeah. Jenny, is that accurate with what you just said?
In a general, that's how we've, yeah. And I don't know if HRNA would want to speak any more on that, but I think unless there's additional questions, we could move on, recognizing we just got the hour warning, so.
Mayor Walker?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with Councillor Hill's point a while back. I think, that's a focus that we should really, try to get in order. I know we were hoping that we wouldn't have individual developers or property owners come in before us as they do now with the special use permit, but it doesn't seem like that is going to be possible. And if people, developers or, private landowners are able to build 4 units before they are even considering an affordable one, then we are back to the comments on regarding the density for density's sake. And I think we have to decide where we are in that process. So anything after 1, are we requiring? And I also think projects like Friendship Court and the CRHA redevelopment and rehab, it took a lot of partnership and it took a lot of people thinking outside of what has been normal to date. And so even though we don't know what the process will be and whether the mechanisms are in place to serve that process well, we have to think along those lines of if there's a affordability requirement, it either won't happen or we'll figure out how to subsidize it. And by the time it's presented, Planning Commission counselors, they'll know that it will take some or private philanthropy, that it'll take some type of investments to make these units happen.
That matches my understanding. Ms. Cook, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, I didn't catch up. I didn't know if there was a specific question in there. I want to make sure.
It wasn't a question. I just heard 2 things. I heard that we are allowing up to the 4 units because then the example was given that it takes 10 units before you can build an affordable one. If we base what we are attempting to create on what is currently or what has been done historically in Charlottesville and around the country, we're never going to get to where we're desiring. So we have to think about it, I think, in terms of this is our goal, and we know that it's going to take some partnerships and to get there, and financing that's not stipulated in the way that previous or current financing streams are stipulated. And the question becomes, if we are going to allow these units, which it becomes the density for density's sake, or will we allow these units only if they are subsidized in a way that will ensure affordability?
Right. I mean, well, one thing I want to note about the density for density's sake argument, which I appreciate, people not wanting just to build additional housing for the sake of it. But in all of this, we are looking at not just building new housing units under current, guidelines, current sort of size restrictions and whatnot. We're looking at changing the type of units that can be built.
Yes.
So smaller units, smaller lot sizes, things that can support units that are more likely to be built even under current regulations. But and we've also built in, Lee mentioned what's possible without subsidy, but the city has committed to finding funding to, in part, one thing you'll be looking at funding with that is subsidy for incentivizing or supporting affordable units. So we certainly recognize there is subsidy involved and there's subsidy planned. But I think, again, the way we've thought about this is that we want to make sure there's housing being built that supports sort of all levels of affordability. And we think that by allowing that sort of base of market rate, we can even better support additional, affordable units as well. But again, I would welcome Lee or others to respond as well, and quickly if you can.
I'll try to be brief, Mayor. I think one of the keys here is that in the sensitive areas, it's presumed that the existing house is most likely to be used as the affordable house because it's easier to rehab and less expensive to rehab that than to build new. That is an unlikely scenario in many of the remaining neighborhoods of the city. The main house, unless we are splitting the main house, which is a possibility under these kinds of rules, unless we're splitting the main house up into, for example, 3 or 4 units, the affordability won't come from the main building. It would come from the slightly less expensive new small units that would likely be built in response to the kinds of regulations we're talking about. So that equity lens of who can live in which neighborhoods begins to change, even if units are closer to market rate or at market rate in these areas. As long as they are smaller, it is providing more opportunity for some to live in those areas. But it will still require subsidy for certain people to join in and live in those areas. So we need to be looking at all of that, but there is a reason to produce more housing in the city. And that reason is most of your housing has been going out to the county. And when Councilmember Schnook was talking about this earlier, my initial thought was 1% may not be right because your housing market has been so tight for so long. It may not represent what the housing market, is actually willing to do under kinds of rules that get you the kinds of housing that you would like to see. So that's what some of these ideas surround is making it more possible to build a closer to affordable unit in these areas, in addition to the unit that's already there.
Mayor Walker, is that helpful?
It's helpful, but I've been saying this the entire time that I've been on council. We are seeing when you have, houses, single family homes in Belmont going for almost $500,000, you just have to be realistic about what building closer to affordable, who will be able to afford that. I think, this is back to probably, Councilor McGill's question about determining affordability and how do you are building for. And a lot of people throughout, citizens throughout my time have talked about if you just build more housing, that will free up the housing for lower income people. And without being intentional about that, I still don't believe that is the case, and nothing about the trends in Charlottesville is showing us that that's the case.
Thank you. Commissioner Russell?
I agree wholeheartedly. And back to what Mayor Walker said about partnering with other organizations, I think we should think about what the housing plan says, which is to lay out a path to increase the number of subsidized affordable homes. But if we aren't purposeful about where we direct this, then will we just continue to sort of concentrate poverty rather than what we intend to do, which is make our neighborhoods more equitable. So I'm really concerned about the general residential not requiring with enough realistic teeth, I guess, the affordability that we say we want. Strategy 2.1 of the housing chapter draft of the comp plan says that the zoning changes will allow mixed income neighborhoods by right, but how are we how are we really doing that? We're not, if we're just sort of hoping for it, it brings me a lot of concern.
Ms. Cook, do you have something on that?
I would just be reiterating things I've said. You know, I think I would go back to what we discussed previously, was that we can, perhaps there's, I think it was in response to something Councillor Hill said, you know, perhaps you look at ways within that, what we've established as the base of general residential up to 4, you know, we can look at potentially, and I think the plan actually does state this in the chapter, and I could find it, you know, that we will explore whether that is a feasible way to a feasible requirement to have in there to require the first or second new unit to be affordable at a certain level in the general residential areas outside of sensitive areas. It's just something that we, you know, at this point, without, you know, having that analysis that will be under our belt in the zoning process, we're hesitant to put in at this point.
Ms. Russell, is that helpful?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm hesitant to get behind something that doesn't have those assurances at this point. And it feels like we keep kicking the can down the road. And this is really important.
Thank you. Councillor Payne?
Yeah, I've got a number of questions. I guess first, just to clarify my own thinking, when it comes to the discussion of general residential, is the trade-off basically, if we expand the sensitive area approach citywide to all general residential, that the market won't build any of those affordable units? So basically what it would be doing is saying, if additional units are built in general residential, it will only occur if it's being combined with subsidy either from the city, state, or federal government to produce those additional affordable units citywide.
If I understand your question correctly, just tell me if I'm not. But I think that's when we're talking about sort of inclusionary mechanisms. Lee had mentioned, you know, 1 in 10 is typically sort of the number you can get at a large scale. We're trying to incentivize that inclusion of affordable units in these smaller scale developments in general residential by allowing this base of market rate units that can help to support additional affordable units within that. I'm sorry, I think I'm not responding fully to your question.
Well, I know I'm not wording it very clearly, but I guess it's just like if the approach in the sensitive areas of requiring you have that base of 1 and then above it, it has to be affordable, set it, and we haven't set what that is. But if that was expanded citywide, basically what's being done is, in order to get any increase in any general residential throughout the city, realistically, the market will not produce those affordable units. So we're saying any additional units citywide in general residential will have to come through a subsidy from the state, local, or federal government to actually achieve that affordability that the market won't. Is that accurate?
That's we think that would be most likely, yes. If we're requiring especially affordable units first in those areas, that's why we're looking to not include that. We want to make it more realistic that we don't necessarily need subsidy for all of that, but there would still be, you know, yes, I think yes is the answer to your question.
I will add as well that there are ways to make units affordable in these general residential areas by perhaps limiting the lot size of those subdivided lots, and also perhaps even limiting the unit size in some cases, so that we can ensure that those units are more naturally affordable and lend themselves more towards the affordable spectrum. So those are tools that we can use at our disposal as well to encourage the development of more affordable units.
Which was another question, is something that's come up, is trying to get to more affordability through the building footprint, lot size, setbacks, parking requirements. I'm guessing that's something that is just entirely going to be addressed in the zoning rewrite part of this, and
it's been,
we
yeah,
haven't yet gotten there.
We list out, you know, in the, I think it's goal 1 of the land use urban form historic and cultural preservation chapter, that that zoning goal in there does list out what we're looking at, including those lot size, parking requirements and whatnot that you just mentioned, setbacks.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we've not yet.
Another question is,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Another question is, an idea I've heard floated about is allowing 2/2 townhomes up to 4 stories citywide, or apartments up to 4 stories citywide if they're 100% affordable. Is that something that's at all been contemplated? And likewise, is that something that the market would not likely be to respond to? And likewise, would you probably get those if you're combining it with some kind of subsidy?
Lee, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, we have continued the conversation about those possibilities. There's kind of a hint that maybe we would be willing to allow a 4th floor. It produces a very different form of development than what is on those sites today. It would not be felt by most to be gentle or soft density. It might be more affordable, but it invokes that, 4 stories of height versus 2.5 that might be there on adjacent sites today. So we have struggled with that issue, and for now we've suggested that's why medium intensity exists, is to allow those forms, whether they're built in medium intensity, with or without subsidy. They will be an excellent source of more, slightly less expensive units if we can produce those. So at present, we are talking about those mostly in the medium intensity areas, but we think there might be occasions, and the 2/2 is an interesting question. If you put a 2/2 on a hillside that slopes away from the street, so down away from the street, you can disguise some of its bulk and mass. And so maybe there are some tools and techniques like that we can use that bring that back into play in some of those areas. So we will be looking at that seriously in the zoning. We've heard loud and clear that those housing types are the most affordable to construct right this minute. So we're hoping to find ways to incorporate them.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, obviously, if it's being conditioned on being allowed, if it's 100% affordability, I know there's lots of different perspectives on it, but you're definitely not just getting density for density's sake in that case. Another question is, in the definition of both medium and high intensity, it makes reference to either bonuses or inclusionary zoning affordability requirements. Is that just, again, something that is completely not set out at this moment and unknown, and will be developed in the zoning rewrite process in terms of determining even just like what the base rate is throughout the city, and even just the height and number of units that will in effect actually be allowed conditioned on affordability? Because that just is obviously a big question mark.
Yeah, we've maintained what we would say is flexible as we go into the zoning ordinance, recognizing again that we've got a lot of analyses that will be happening, and our goal is to incentivize or require as deep affordability as possible in as many places as we can. But we don't want to propose something in the comprehensive plan and then get through those zoning analyses and then say, well, this is not actually feasible, so we can't, respond to this, or it would need such subsidy that we're not going to get any housing at all. Those are drastic comments, of course, but I'm just trying to get at the reason why we haven't included that explicitly, levels of affordability or numbers in this proposal.
And then final question is, I know I've heard a lot of concern around particularly high intensity, but to a lesser extent, medium intensity. For me, the biggest concern is thinking about development patterns, thinking about something like the standard that, overshadows some of our public housing sites, as well as Friendship Court, where you've got a major risk of development sort of completely towering over and crowding out the design that residents have said they wanted. Likewise, our public housing sites, there's been a resident vision statement in terms of the kind of development pattern and height they want to see. Particularly in those kind of cases, is it anticipated that in the zoning rewrite, there's going to be a very plenty of time and the ability to have a very careful approach in terms of looking at the impact that that greater intensity can cause? Again, my concern is particularly for these neighborhoods that are facing gentrification and displacement pressure and seeing these luxury units towering over their neighborhood.
Lee, you want to take that?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I think the key here is to think about the zoning exercise in two halves. One half is the map. That's really what you're talking about right this minute, because I think we can all agree that we could write a good district that in the appropriate place, has the right impact. And if we apply it in the wrong place on the map, we get a bad outcome. So the text and the map are two different things. What we are really looking for is the general guidance of the future land use map, and then the opportunity to build the text for the various districts. And once we sort of have agreement that yes, somewhere in town these districts should exist, then we'll move on and get the mapping work done. How much time we have for that will have everything to do with the council at the time. I'm certain there's not, we are beyond our original timeline, and there's not a lot of time shown. We show ourselves building out the text and at least getting the map on the table before the end of next year. And that would mean adoption either right before the end of the year or in the spring, typically. And how long that conversation has to last is a tough question. Not every site has to be zoned to its maximum intensity immediately. So it could well be that you're comfortable applying a certain level and that you want to study more some of the places and apply a higher level at some point in time. So there will be options even within the existing future land use map. There'll be options available to increase or decrease the intensity when looking at the zoning map.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's one of the things I've struggled with is just, this is really just one very small step of this process that is not even getting into some of the most important changes we're actually going to make. I guess the final just comment I have is I'm thinking about like our housing needs assessment. I think the number was 1,200 new affordable units by 2040. And it definitely seems pretty clear that the only way to get there is through subsidy, and just thinking about how we combine our zoning with those opportunities, with that 10 million a year in our housing plan, and hopefully also state and federal level money that could be available. And that's the only way we're ever going to get those affordable units. The market is just not going to produce them no matter what zoning changes we make. And so given that, it seems clear there's a lot of room to condition some of it on 100% affordability or greater affordability levels. I guess the trade-off that is a question to me is, in a lot of the city that seems to clearly make sense. The only question is whether in very wealthy neighborhoods with absolutely no displacement and gentrification pressure, because they're already just homes worth well over $1 million. If you're losing opportunities potentially for a more affordable duplex to get built or triplex to get built, granted, we have to be honest that those housing types are still going to be, who knows exactly, but it could easily be $400,000 or $500,000 and are not going to be affordable even at 80% AMI, certainly not 50, 60 or 0 to 30% AMI. And so it seems to me it's almost like two completely different tools, the subsidy and how we combine our zoning with that, and then what, if any, role we want for the market rate. But the market rate is just not going to produce the deeper affordability. Anyway, that's the final thought I have at this moment.
Thank you, Councilor Payne. Commissioner Stolzenberg.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on Councilor Payne's, I think it was his first question. Jenny, I think I heard you say that if you require affordable units for that base soft density in outside the sensitive areas, in our historically exclusionary areas, that is, you have a single family zoning by right, and then potentially more with affordability. I think you said that nothing beyond single family houses would pencil. And so unless it was like nonprofit affordable, we'd effectively be enshrining single family zoning in our exclusionary areas. Is that what I just heard?
So just let me repeat that just to make sure I understood. So you're asking if the reason, and this is again why we're showing market rate up to 4 in these areas that are historically exclusionary, because the concern is that if we say anything above single family would need to be affordable, or at least those first few, if we say that right now without looking at it deeper, our concern, yes, is that we want to make sure there are incentives to develop something beyond single family housing. And if those first few units need to be affordable and would require a subsidy, we would expect to see much less of that happen. And we do, as you said, we want to incentivize other housing opportunities in those neighborhoods beyond just the single family residential that's typically built today.
So we'd see a lot less in those areas. And I think we said earlier that we would see a lot more pressure on sensitive areas. And so that's kind of the tilt that would happen there.
That's right. And while we can still certainly, the city, you all, those in the CAF committee could still target funding to those other areas for other initiatives to help homeowners maintain in their homes. We would expect those, there'll be more pressure in those areas than otherwise.
Thanks.
Councilor Miguel.
Thank you. I have 2 things. One, what has been considered about recommending no new gas hookups to new build? I didn't see that in there, and just wondering maybe why it wouldn't have been, or.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Senna. James, would you mind speaking on this?
Sure. Hi. A number of us staff got together this week and have had a number of conversations on this topic. We had staff from the Utilities Division, from our DPW Sustainability Division, and from MDS. And really at this point, what we're asking is that we be given an opportunity to really study this issue more closely. What we know is that there's a great deal of complexity here, that we have technology complexity, we have financial complexity, both in terms of city finances as well as the financial state of our residents. And we need to be able to look at all of those issues together and then bring recommendations back to City Council on this issue. So we're asking for a little more flexibility here at this comprehensive plan level, so that as we go forward into our climate action planning, and most importantly, as we go forward into implementation of this work, that we have time and the space to kind of come up with solutions that we can present to City Council.
Okay. My second question / comment is, I know there's a lot of restrictions on the state level of what we can ask with Airbnb and short-term stays and everything. However, and we have some things in place. However, enforcement is very difficult. And I was just wondering if because I'm not seeing anything in the comprehensive plan really that's addressing that. I believe some of that might have been addressed a little bit in the affordable housing piece, as I recall. But if there could be some, because I'm looking at an apartment building right now on VRBO that has been turned into a short-term stay. It's one of the few small apartment buildings in Belmont, and that is now all Airbnb. And I am very worried that that is going to be a continuation. And that this is just going to keep getting worse because it's much more economically viable in a lot of ways for people. And so just either recommendations that we continue to fight this at a state level, or if there's anything that is been found in other cities that they have been able to actually maintain the enforcement, just because it is so difficult with Airbnb and VRBO not giving us the information we need to actually proceed with enforcement or partnering with us with enforcement at all. So thank you.
I was trying to pull up the document and I realized this one will not open. So for anyone who's been trying to open the document online, I will make sure that's remedied here in short order. But we do have a discussion about looking at short-term rentals, ways to mitigate the impact of short-term rentals. And I believe we added text about enforcement, sort of making sure there are resources for enforcement, but that's what I was trying to double check in that. You know, that could certainly be a piece of that does need to be happening. You know, as you've noted, there are enforcement mechanisms in place, that maybe just the resources are not there. So that does need more support in that area. I don't know if Lee or others would have specific mechanisms you want to mention. I know we're running short on time, so or James.
I'll just say really quickly that, I mean, ultimately this is a land use issue and we have an existing set of rules. And so the key issue, as Jenny's kind of pointing to, is enforcement. We're looking at what creative solutions we might be able to come up with to better do enforcement. It's not time. It doesn't make sense from a time perspective for us to continually scan VRBO and Airbnb and all the different websites. Understand that. And as you know, they aren't going to necessarily cooperate with us and on the enforcement side. So we are looking at tools. Ultimately, worst case scenario, there are services out there that will essentially scrape those websites for you for a fee and provide the reporting back to you. So that's an option if we have to go there, but we're trying to figure out what we can do in-house using our own tools. So we are working on it though. Thank you for raising the question.
I was more concerned about from the legislative side, I guess, because I know that, I mean, I've gone and looked, and it's unless you're somebody who's lived here for a very long time, it's sometimes very hard to even identify what building that is, because it's not identified. And so it's more about what have other places been able to do statewide to get the information from the term rental companies, or to enlist their aid in making sure that they're checking to make sure the people are in qualification with local ordinances.
Yeah, I think Berkeley, California has a pretty good Airbnb regulations, you know, and then again, the legislation in California, I believe, might be different from Virginia, you know, in terms of the enforcement process. However, I think if we have the same legislation they have in California, we can probably have the kind of regulations that they have in Berkeley, California. They do charge a considerable amount of money. They put it on the Airbnb. Their reporting requirement is different. The enforcement mechanism is pretty robust and elaborate, but we have to transfer that expense, you know, to the Airbnb.
Did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Commissioner Mitchell?
Oh, yeah, just a quick statement. The objective of my email regarding natural gas was not to immediately decrease our footprint. The objective was to get us to thinking about stopping the growth of our footprint. So as you're working through that, James, just the immediate objective is just not to grow it anymore and to take advantage of the downward slope that we're seeing with Dominion.
Understood. And I really appreciated the email and appreciate the comment, because I think in the conversation we're having at the staff level, we're looking at this as a phased approach, with that first phase, thinking about how we kind of manage the growth now or stop the growth or whatever the appropriate answer is towards whatever eventual goal kind of makes sense for the city. But we are looking at it in that kind of a phased approach. But again, appreciate the comment.
Commissioner Russell?
I wanted to move on to talk about medium intensity residential. So unless Rory has something to follow up on the okay. Is it okay if I go back to that? This is
Please.
I am what I'm hearing is that it doesn't seem what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is not a clear articulation of our methodology, or I should say the consultant's methodology for assigning certain areas as medium intensity residential. And Jenny, I know you said that some of the considerations are that these areas be near parks and schools and generally around areas where there's multimodal opportunities, but that it also seems like they are overlaid in places where there is an existing built out neighborhood and maybe lacking opportunities for certainly infill, if not, multi-unit development. So can we just talk about that a little more and why those areas have been chosen?
Sure. So we did include the land use planning objectives, which don't speak directly to medium intensity, for example, but they do sort of give some description, such as you mentioned. I talked about parks and schools. We also looked at employment centers. It has some of those factors in there. But to speak more directly to your concern that some of these areas don't have potential to immediately incorporate additional housing, they're built out, as you mentioned, and we think some of these areas have potential to incorporate greater intensity by splitting existing homes, for example, having an ADU, for example, having additional either splitting existing structures or having additional structures. There are places that have vacant lots in these areas that could allow more than that. But overall, we're trying to give this future land use vision. We're not saying this is something that needs to happen immediately in all of these areas, but we're trying to put out informed by sort of logical planning methodology or planning objectives is how we've laid this out. So I agree with you that not all of these areas would have potential to immediately change or should not immediately change, but we're trying to give the overall framework for development in the city in the longer term in order to better support access to amenities, as we've discussed, as well as potential new infrastructure investments, such as with multimodal transportation and otherwise.
Anyone else want to take up this topic?
I just want to mention, so I know that you said you went through PUDs, but I mean, last time, like I said, I just pulled some examples, but they weren't comprehensive. But Cherry Hill is off of Cherry Avenue, and that's a PUD full of, very tight row houses. It's just another example of what I'm not seeing the link between how some of these areas were selected for medium intensity, because I'm not seeing how we're going to get more than what we have there. And again, that has an overarching PUD as well.
So with
just an example.
Yes, with the PUDs, we went through and looked for a couple of things. One is if they had existing development that was at the medium intensity sort of a development type, attached houses, for example, townhouses. And then we also looked where it sits within the overall framework outside of those PUDs. So if there was a PUD that was directly adjacent to a school or a park or another corridor of medium intensity, we look to often show those as medium intensity in accordance with that overall planning framework. Ron, do you want to expand on that at all with how we looked at PUDs?
No, I think that's absolutely right. We went back through, looked at where we have medium intensity style development on the map, made sure those are medium intensity. We pulled back on some areas, as you mentioned, that are already built out, that may be off corridor or off near where amenities are located. So we went back and evaluated that. I think we also need to keep in mind with the medium intensity that, we say up to 12 units per lot. We recognize that every lot won't have 12 units, won't hit the net maximum. And that, as we mentioned earlier, all of these land use categories be broken down into specific zoning districts. You can look to the existing future land use map. There's 9 key land use categories on the existing map, but there's 30 zoning districts. So we will see the same evolution as we move forward into the zoning phase of how we begin to further evaluate on a neighborhood by neighborhood, corridor by corridor basis, what the intensity of this medium intensity will look like. We expect that a lot of these areas are going to break down further. So we do want to keep that in mind as well, that, this future lands map is meant to be general so that we can have more flexibility to break these areas down into sub-districts moving into the zoning phase.
Commissioner Russell, was that helpful?
I guess it just seems like this is this medium intensity up to 12 units, and then to sort of say, well, in some places it won't really be that, has caused a lot of residents to be really upset and upset with the ambiguity and lack of clarity around the methodology kind of just being general. So, I don't know what else to say other than it leaves a lot to be desired in the future phases.
Thank you. Commissioner Stolzenberg?
Yeah, so I'd like to change to a couple completely different topics. First, Dan and Sunshine sent 3 other comments different from the sensitive thing or general outside of sensitive thing. One was to allow 4 units in general residential outside of sensitive without the existing structure. And then 2 was to allow in sensitive areas to allow more than 4 if they're affordable, right? So just like in regular general, we have more than 4 with the bonus program to allow density in sensitive areas if they're affordable. And I think that's consistent with what we've heard from CLIC, what we heard in our Cherry Avenue plan outreach, is that people are okay with density as long as there's affordability, right? And then their 4th point was kind of a subset of 3, which was like, if you're doing that, then you don't necessarily need to keep the existing house. And then separately, in the responses to comments about townhouses in general residential, you wrote, we support adding an allowance for townhouses if they can limit, et cetera. I don't see that allowance in the text. When you say we support adding it, were you expecting us to come up with an amendment to add it?
To the second point, no, we had, I thought we had included that in here as part of the zoning. It would have been maybe under the zoning ordinance text. Let's see. I can look to find that as well.
No problem. That's okay. If it is in there, I might have just missed it.
But I guess in terms of you mentioned a couple of things from HAC folks. So I just wanted to make sure, was there a specific item you'd like us to respond to from what they recommended?
Yeah, really just those two things. I mean, in particular, I think the major one that I think sometimes as community needs, I think probably the most important is in sensitive areas for affordable housing, allowing more dense than the 4 limit.
You're right. They're right that we have not included that sort of the bonus idea that we have in other locations, the other general residential area, for example. So perhaps that is something we could include as, a possibility in the next phase. But again, we recognize that these areas, many of these areas are, highly desirable for development. And so we're trying to reduce any displacement risk as much as possible. But I think that may make sense to say if it meets affordability criteria, that perhaps additional units could be allowed.
Yeah, and I understood it to be different than just the regular bonus where you have, some affordable and a bunch of market rates. It's more if it's all affordable or very strict affordability requirements, was my understanding and what I was told.
So I think in that case, then, that would be something where if you all would like to propose that could be proposed as a change.
Councilor Snook?
I wanted to comment on a couple of things. One was the suggestion that had been floated about basically finessing the issue for now of the medium intensity zone. I think it's fair to say that we have gotten more complaints about that than any other issue. And they are complaints that are visceral. They are not complaints that we can simply dismiss by saying, you don't know what you're talking about, or there's more to come, or there is a zoning ordinance that will solve all of these problems. That has not been a very persuasive argument to people, that they don't worry, it'll all work out when the specter of a 12-unit apartment complex in your backyard is staring at you. And so I fear that that is going to become such a contentious, or already is a contentious issue, but when it gets down to actually voting first for the Planning Commission, then for the City Council, that feels to me like an issue that isn't ready to be discussed. More than any other issue, that is an issue that needs the zoning ordinance before we can decide how to use it, how to deal with it. And I've tried to make the argument to people, we had to start with the comp plan and future land use map plan because our zoning ordinance was so defective, it could not serve as the basis for moving forward. We had to start someplace. Let's start with the future land use map and the comp plan. Then we go to the zoning ordinance. That makes eminent good sense to me, but it doesn't sell. And I think we have to recognize that that's just, it's just a political reality. The other thing related to that, though, is we also have to acknowledge that any rezoning we're going to be doing pursuant to this is going to be a very slow moving tool. It is not going to create an automatic Shazam, buildings are going to get torn down, new apartment buildings are going to go up. And it's a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year kind of change, which also suggests that we probably should take the time to get that piece right. And so I would just like to say, I think that the way forward on that is to take out is to leave the medium intensity zone or category of land use there, but just not assign anything to it at this point, or maybe not assign anything new to it at this point. I have to think a little bit about that, and then figure that at some point, once we've got the zoning ordinance in hand, and we can look lot by lot how that zoning ordinance would affect that particular lot, then we can do that in a way that isn't going to be scaring the bejesus out of everybody in the city. That's my comment.
Okay, well, thank you, Lloyd. I'm happy to react to that, but I would like to let James, perhaps, I saw you come off mute. Would you like to respond to that first?
Sure, Councillor Snook. I think one of the ideas, and I think this is something I've heard you say as well, is the idea of revisiting the FLUM, oh, I hate to use that acronym, revisiting the land use map at the time of zoning adoption. That as we get into this, as we get into the process of the zoning rewrite, we're going to be doing a lot more kind of ground truthing. There's going to be a lot more in-depth discussion in each of these areas. And if we kind of go into that process recognizing that as we do this, we will plan to come back to the land use map. And maybe we say that up front right here in the comprehensive plan. Councilor, do you think that starts to address the concern?
Intellectually, it should, but it won't.
It won't.
I don't think. Not from what I'm hearing from people.
Are there others that have a comment on that? Because to me, this is actually one of those critical issues, particularly as we're looking at the possibility of a planning commission vote as early as tomorrow, given the timeline that we're looking at. I'd love to hear from other commissioners or councilors on this point.
I've already expressed I should definitely share this concern.
But I should also say, I think there has to be a time, and maybe it's a year from now, there has to be a time when we talk about increasing the density to include the medium intensity use. My fear is that right now you've got 70% of the city, the folks who are in R1 zones right now, who are concerned, just convinced that there's going to be a 12-unit apartment building in their backyard. And that is, I mean, I don't, frankly, I don't care about the electoral consequences. I'm not up for re-election for another couple of years, and who knows? We'll have a chance to address the issue before then. But I am concerned that I think that when people are upset at this visceral emotional level, that is not something that we can just sort of push aside and say, we'll get to it. Y'all calm down. That's not a good response.
So I think, Councilor Payne, I think it's your go if you were gonna.
Sure, just my final comment is just the concern I have is, the zoning is, if the goal is affordable housing, and particularly our housing needs assessment 1,200 units by 2040, in addition to preserving existing affordable units. With that goal in mind, my concern is we get an outcome where we use the zoning tool, which on its own isn't that helpful for that 1,200 new affordable units, and is using market rate tools, which have a role, but are limited, and again, not going to get that 1,200, that we just end up in a situation where we've done that zoning and market rate piece, and we don't have any guarantee of the affordability. And particularly, I'm thinking here in mind of, we have our affordable housing plan, but it's not funded yet, and we don't even have a clear strategy of how we're going to fund it. And I'm certainly going to continue advocating that we do fund it and find that out, but we haven't done that yet. So there's no guarantee that that piece is locked in. And my concern is if we get the zoning piece, but we haven't done that 10 million, and we haven't figured out not only how we're going to fund it, but how we're going to target it, that we'll end up repeating the development pattern of density pushed into low-income housing neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods staying largely as is, and that same development pattern could get repeated. So again, that's just my major concern. And so given that, I would certainly, just from a policy standpoint, it would seem to to me seem wise to say that, you know, we'll revisit the land use map either during or after the zoning rewrite process, in part because there's so many unknowns in that zoning rewrite process that if we are going through that and we're seeing that like this is not meeting the affordability goals we wanted to see in terms of inclusionary zoning, bonuses, et cetera, that there's some opportunity to revisit it. You know, I obviously don't want to just kick the can down the road forever, but that's my concern, is that we get the zoning, but we don't get the other pieces of affordability and de facto repeat some of these development patterns. So anyway, that's my concern. And it would seem like it's just extremely important to keep the focus on how we're going to fund the 10 million, and also think about things like community land trusts and who owns land, and how do we get more land under the ownership of either community land trusts, CRHA, Habitat, other housing nonprofits, as well as to get more people who are renters to figure out how can they own their land too, which is going to create less displacement pressure in some of these areas. Anyway, that's my lingering concern.
Mayor Walker, final thoughts, please.
You know, there is concern about the intensity, so the density in these areas, but we have known, as in the past, and that we can amend the document if we don't make change. So my two concerns: if we don't make the changes, it may not happen. And then if we're not, if the voices that have been the loudest about a 12 unit apartment building, when it's not even possible at this point, based on, you know, their surrounding area, for that to occur. And a lot of things would happen for that to occur that those are not the voices that we should feed into. What does this look like if we do delay until the zoning rewrite, when we know that at the point of the zoning rewrite, if there are amendments that need to be made to this document, that we'll make them, or that they'll be made. They'll have to be considered. And so a lot of the fears is that we have heard over the past few months are in response to change. And we know that we have to make those changes, and then for people to understand that we're taking into consideration during the next part of the process, which we've always said is the most instrumental part of this process, whether what has been presented is actually possible and under what circumstances.
Thank you. Mr. Habab?
Thank you. I want to say I agree with Mayor Walker. For the medium intensity, I get that in some specific lots right now it might not be applicable, but I would be afraid of taking it out and then just not getting back to it. That's a very real possibility, and that'd be a loss. And it's something that we said we'll analyze in the zoning. Similar to, I think, the affordability bonus. My understanding is that that's something that could still be tweaked throughout the zoning process, kind of not really tied to the future land use map. So I don't know if that needs to be voted on again or not, or if that could just be part of the zoning map that comes out of the zoning process.
Yeah, that would be part of the zoning process, is how we envision it, just to clarify.
Councilor Hill?
I certainly recognize that people are, reacting to just change, but I think that we've acknowledged for many years that we were going to be at a point, finally at this point, where we're getting rid of R1 zoning in the entire city of Charlottesville, and we're going more than just two units in many of these cases. And so to me, I do think that this is a tremendous amount of change for any homeowner or anyone living in the city to kind of digest. And so for me, I understand the concern of someone who sees that their neighborhood might be going to a medium intensity when they bought their home. And I'll be honest, I agree. I think I'm mostly concerned about those neighborhoods where the housing values are more in that middle income workforce kind of levels than the areas that it's just not going to happen in some of the other neighborhoods, because there's just the finances aren't going to work that way. But I do think that for regardless of the property value, for anyone who purchased their home at any point in time, having the expectation that they were moving into, say like an R1 neighborhood, I think we're already taking leaps and bounds away from what that expectation was. And I just think we have to recognize this is really hard for people to kind of put their head around. And so that's why I am really vocal about just the medium intensity, and not saying it doesn't have a place in this map. I think it absolutely does. I just wish we could be more holistic about how we're looking at it and let that happen through the zoning process. Because I think we've suddenly forgotten how much we're actually doing with just eliminating R1 housing throughout the city. And I think that's a huge, huge step forward.
Seeing that it's 2:02, I would entertain a motion. Mr. Snook? Look like you have something on your mind. Mayor
Sorry,
Walker?
that's an accident. It is 2:02.
Commissioner Russell?
Yes, I'd like to present a motion to adjourn. I think that's what I do. Does that
Seems
happen?
reasonable to me. Can I have a vote? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Thank you very much. Adjourning to tomorrow to discuss this in much greater length. Thank you all.
Thank you.